lecture number 2 for this week, which is actually lecture number 5. So, for this second half, we're going to be kind of picking up where the Picasso and Cézanne lecture left off. So, within the lineage of the art history that we are looking at, it pretty much goes Cézanne, Picasso, Cubism / Futurism, which is what we're dealing with right now, and then the First World War. So a lot of the things that we're talking about are things that were aesthetic developments that led up to the First World War, and then the First World War completely changed everything, and the world after 1914, more or less, is very, very different. And so we're going to look at some more works from before 1914. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what goes on in France and also what goes on in Italy. The Cubists were living in Paris. The Futurists were living in Italy. Excuse me. So, to get the ball rolling, we're going to look at the other Cubist. So Cubism is divided into two different periods. One of those periods is called Analytic Cubism. The other one of those is called Synthetic Cubism. Analytic Cubism involved the breaking down of the image. It involved the so it was the breaking down of image, the flattening out of the palette. And when I say that, I mean that they basically went through one tonality. They painted in one color. Generally speaking, they were only using browns and ochres. They really didn't like color. They didn't like black or gray or anything on the black to white gray scale. They were really specifically dealing with one kind of color. Ultimately, though, when I talk about the idea of breaking down the image, it's under the auspices of an analysis. So they're doing a visual analysis of, say, a person sitting in a cafe playing an instrument. Like there's a violinist in one of them. There's a guitar player in another one of them. There's a woman in another one of them. Or it's the analysis of the basically the actual table at a cafe, because what the Cubists were doing is they were meeting initially. Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso were meeting at cafes. They were talking about painting with our other painter friends, but Georges Braque and Picasso would go back to the studio and actually make works together. Braque would be working on one canvas, Picasso would be working on another. They did not co-author things, and that they did not make one canvas that they both had their hands in. It's the other way around. They were both working in the same room on their own projects. One over here, one over here. A funny little tidbit to that end is that several times while they were going back and forth from their studio to the gallery that they were dealing with, which was the Kienweiler gallery that I mentioned in the last lecture, they wore matching jumpsuits because they saw themselves as workers, and they were workers. They were going to work, and the two of them were working together. And so they would wear these matching uniforms and go into the studio together. So it's a bromance, to put it in contemporary weird terms. So that's Analytic Cubism. Analytic Cubism is, generally speaking, pre-1911. Synthetic Cubism is the next step. So like you analyze something, meaning you break it down into multiple parts and you look at it for what it actually is. Synthetic Cubism is putting the image back together. So they're assembling these things. The one really, really, really important thing is that the synthetic cubism involves collage. So they're taking something, they have a painting, excuse me, they're taking sheets of paper, here I'll use paper that we all know, so money, and they're affixing it to the painting. And they're doing this specifically to say, I don't want to paint money, I'm just going to put money there. Now they do it with things like newspapers to start off, where they initially, why bother painting all of the words on the page of a newspaper when you can just take the newspaper and put it on the canvas, and voila, you're done. Synthetic cubism is 1911 to roughly 1914. It actually stops a little bit before then. Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso, their working relationship fell apart, especially in the build-up to the First World War. And I'm going to talk all about the war later on. It's an incredibly important event, and it's a kind of warfare that we don't understand. It's a kind of nationalist pride that we understand, but not in the same way that Europeans were thinking about it in 1914. So, this is a weird little impromptu slide. It's like a chalkboard, so that's that. But that's the beauty of these video lectures. Let's go back to Georges Braque. One thing I hope that looking at this work reminds you of is the way that I explained the painting style of Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne was using a flat piece of one color and putting it next to or adjacent to a directional brush stroke, and thereby creating an architecture. Georges Braque was obviously very familiar with this painting style because he does it here and all over this painting. He's just all into this whole motif. He is very, very inspired by Paul Cézanne. As is to be expected, a lot of people are very inspired by Paul Cézanne. He's a very inspirational guy. And, like I was saying, he did pass around this time, and so there was a lot of conversation about his work and about his legacy. So those are important things to think about. This is not, however, a cubist work. It seems like it could be, because the things are roughly made into cubes, but it's not analytic enough. Analytic cubism really is defined by the both Picasso and Braque being in the same studio. This work was not made under those auspices. And this work is getting us toward where Braque engages with cubism, but it's not necessarily, he's not all the way there. And I say that because this is actually what a cubist work looks like. So the big differences here. Obviously, one seems to make sense, whereas another one visually is difficult to understand what's happening. This makes sense. You understand that you're looking at a landscape. You understand that you have this area which is very close to the picture's edge, and then it goes back and recesses as it goes that way. So there's this recession of space. That is part of the pictorial tradition of making paintings, right? Think of Ingres' Grand Odalisque. She is laying there, like she's here, but then you can see that there's space that goes behind her and also a little space before her. A foreground, she sits in the middle ground, and then the background. That's how you order a picture. And here you have the foreground, you have the middle ground, and then you have the background. Oops. And those things recede. They make pictorial sense that way, and that is a big part of the history of painting. It is, however, not part of the history of Cubism. Cubism, they were trying to get everything as close to and as flat as possible. All of the information was to be rendered in 2 dimensions. Because one of the things that even Cezanne was guilty of was adhering to this kind of classical stylings, this kind of foreground, middle ground, background motif. Think of Mont Saint Victoire. It existed in the background, and in the foreground were the branches. I'm thinking specifically of the one from the 1880s, not the one from the later one that was much bluer. It's the easiest way to distinguish those two things. So, looking at analytic cubism, we can see here that, this area back here is the background. So there's a little tiny, minuscule amount of distance between the stuff that's up here and the stuff that's back here. Because this is what would be sitting in the very foreground when you see this work in person. This is the violin and palette from 1909, so this is very much part of the analytic cubist tradition. Now, one of the things that you're seeing here that you're probably not trying to figure out what you're seeing here, I guess I should say that first, but so one of the things that you're trying to figure out in this work is, okay, here is a violin, right? But that violin looks like it's been shattered. And the reason that it's been shattered is because it's this, the only way to actually put all of the sides, I'm going to use this mug as an example, the only way to put all of the sides of this mug clearly in a 2-dimensional space is to actually break this mug apart into different planes that it exists on. So one plane would be this part here, this darker bit, the shadow of the mug. Another plane would be the bottom. Another plane would be this large swath of white where it's hitting more light. So that's 3 different planes that we have just on this mug. And so the way that, if with regard to a cubist painting, they would have these 3 things, but they don't necessarily need to make this kind of sense. Because for Braque and Picasso, there's no sense in trying to capture the reality of a violin in a painting. The violin exists in the real. You can see a violin the way that we can see this. I can see this mug in real life. You can see the violin, you can pick up the violin, you can play it if you want to. So translating that real object into the 2-dimensional picture plane really just necessitates having a 2-dimensional surface and dealing entirely with the 2-dimensional surface. So, going from Ang, you have this idea that the picture is a window into another world. The woman, the odalisque, is modeled very well. She seems as though she takes up realistic space. The next step is Edouard Manet, where it's flat. He's beginning to deal with to show the audience that, these are paintings, these are objects, these are things that look like this, that have stuff on the front of them, but nothing on the back of them, and they all have this wooden frame that you see here. Next step being Cezanne. Cezanne says this is really about making objects, and this is really about using pigment and binder on a flat surface to make an object. The cubists are like, all right, we're going to finally answer this question, and we're going to say that the only way to do this is to take 3-dimensional objects, break them apart, and then put all of those pieces onto the flat canvas surface. It seems kind of easy, but when you look, it's easy in concept, it's easy to understand these ideas, but when you look at these works, it's very difficult to try and order them. It's very difficult to try and ascertain why this is saying or purporting to be a violin and palette. Where's the palette? The palette exists in the back. It exists in this series of fractured planes. Now, one of the things that I've always appreciated about Cubism is it leaves a lot for the viewer to actually spend time figuring out. There's a big portion of this work that just demands that you actually stare at these things and you figure out what's going on in them. I mean, that's a big thing that artists always try to do, is to actually have the audience's attention for a long period of time, but it's not always as much of an assignment for the viewer. If you think back to the earlier works, I keep referencing Ingres' Grand Odalisque. It's easy for a viewer to walk up to the painting, to look at the painting, figure out exactly what the painting's about, and then move on. If they would like to, they can spend more time looking at how beautifully Ingres rendered the model, how beautifully he gave her just shadow in the right spaces to give her this three-dimensional volume. But ultimately, the person can just walk by very quickly. When you walk by these works, these Cubist works, and there's not that many of them because there was only a short period of time that these two men were working together. When you see these works in person, it's very difficult to walk by and actually get any kind of understanding of how they're made or what they're doing. They just take a lot of energy. Now, in 1911 is when it's kind of like the highlight year for analytic cubism. Here you can see a work by Georges Braque. It's called Le Portugais, and it's from 1911. Obviously, I just said that. And here you can see, after this kind of hardcore analysis of painting, he has hit upon a method where, here's another one. This is by Pablo Picasso. The style that they're working in is kind of nailed down a little more concretely. There's still some questions that he's going on here, that are going on here. And I said that, right up at the top, right here, there is a very dark hue of brown. It's actually brown. It's not black. It's just the way that these slides are, the way the color registers in these slides. That's just what it is. So. Moving forward, we have this, which does incorporate some darker tones. Some black is in here. There is a little bit of white paint too, and so in the very beginning they were like only using this very minuscule range of colors. At this point, they've expanded it just a little bit. So like bloop, 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 bloop. So I want to give you a side-by-side comparison. These are two important works for you to understand analytic cubism. One of the big features in this body of work, and we can call it that, is that all of the actual work, the physical painting, is mashed into the center. And so you have this very axial arrangement around the center pole. So one of the things that the Cubists understood was that if you're going to entirely reorder the working of painting, you have to have some sort of standardization so that people can still understand what you're doing. It's kind of like how all scientific experiments generally run on the same path, as it were. So they all follow the same scientific model, right? Or the scientific method. And so these guys, when they were working together, they knew, okay, we can't totally reinvent the wheel because that's impossible, so we need to give the audience something that they can go off of. And the easiest way to do that, if you're not arranging things in foreground, middle ground, background, you need to arrange them in some fashion. And so, again, for these guys, the impetus was to just put it here and here. And so you can see, like, there's this kind of situation here. So there's not that much information regarding the thing that they're analyzing. In the one sense, it's a Portuguese musician. In the other sense, it's a portrait of someone who Picasso was romantically involved with at the time. And so, like my video, I'm sitting in the very center of the picture, right? So it makes sense to kind of keep those things operating in the same fashion. That's That's why all the noise, as it were, of these canvases exists in the very center. So looking at them side by side, what you can see is there's a great deal of hard angles. That's where this idea of cubism, where the name cubism comes from, because everything they're doing, they're breaking apart cubes into squares. That's an important thing. So, like, think about when you draw a cube, you have, you know, like boop 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 boop, and you connect these guys, and you have this cube. I mean, it's kind of a rough cube, and it's drawn on top of this thing, so my apologies there, but you know, that's a cube. And so what that cube is actually an assortment of two squares with four lines that connect the points where the corners meet. So when they break those apart, you're going to still have the two squares, but the four lines become obsolete. And so when they put things into structures and they make things into these squares, they understand that, you know, they have to take away some of the information, but they have to give you a little bit of said information. And so where they've removed the physical presence of these people, they basically removed a lot of the soft angles that we all have on our bodies, like the soft curve from your eyebrow into your nose, right? That has been, for better or worse, taken away, but there's still moments of it. Like, look in the center of Brock's painting. There are some slight curved angles. It's not all hard edged. A lot of the critique of, or the criticism of Cubism came because people were highlighting, like, oh, there's all these chaotic things that don't make any sense, and all these angles just confuse me. But what they're not seeing is that so yes, the majority of this work is about hard angles, but it's where they deviate from those hard angles that you can figure out what they're doing and what they're getting at. For instance, if you are, say, to look at, let me go back to just this solo work. I said that this was a Portuguese gentleman playing an instrument. That's what we know this painting to be. And the reason we know that this painting is of that is because Brock alludes to certain aspects of this reality. Right here, we have a circle with some lines going through it. That's very, very similar in shape, although it's very simplified and very abstracted. It's similar to the mouth, or the sound hole and the strings on a guitar. So Brock is looking at a man playing the guitar, and he's giving you certain aspects of the information about what he's seeing so that you can ascertain what he's actually painting here. There is, in this jumble of situation of lines and angles, you see jaw lines. You see other parts of the soft geometry of the human face alluded to. And then you also see this kind of pointed shape indicating the, you know, shoulders here and the angles here. So he's not giving you all the specifics that are relative to the actual body. He's actually saying in certain points, like, this is just how the general shape works. Like, whoop, you have this thing. So, now I am purposefully going through this stuff kind of slowly and rigorously because this is pretty wickedly important for where we're going to be taking the next, where we're going to be taking painting in the next few weeks. So here's the two of them side by side. The important thing here is that they are side by side, and that when they are side by side, it's difficult to know which one was painted by Brock and which one was painted by Picasso. I hope that that you would understand, because I just showed you who did those two things, that, you know, the one, you know, this one is Picasso, this one is Brock. In 1912, we have the beginnings of synthetic cubism. Now, as I was saying before, synthetic cubism means the addition of material to create that cohesive unit. And in this case, we have what looks to be the inclusion of wood grain paper. Actually, what those are is a stamp. There's a you can get a stamp that is faux wood grain or fake wood grain, and you just stamp it, and it actually gives you that wood grain impression. And for this still life with BACH, this cubist collage, drawing, painting, two-dimensional work, it's probably the easiest way to refer to this thing, that's what he's doing. He's basically alluding to the fact that he could put wood paneling there, but he doesn't do it. Instead, he brings in this other thing. And that's the important first step in synthetic cubism, and all synthesis, is you bring an additional thing or an additional set of things into the arena that you're working. And so he's a guy who works specifically with oil paints, some binder, and canvas, right? But now he is incorporating this other motif, this other thing, this other tool. Now it's important to note that that tool was found at a hardware store. So for a long time, artists were going into these shops and they were only buying the thing that they thought they needed, which was oil binder, pigment, binder, and canvas. At this point, this is like one of the first times that artists go into these places of commerce and they begin to look for other things that they can bring into their canvases. This impulse is what our author alludes to in chapter 1, which I don't assign you necessarily, but it is an important thing for you to look at. I actually do assign it in one of the essays. But the breaking out of like just using oil paints or just using this one set of tools is really what helps expand artistic practice. And synthetic cubism is the first time that we see that happening. Pablo Picasso, Glass and Bottle of Suze. Now this is when I was saying earlier that these two guys were dealing with the cafe life, cafe culture, and their relationship to it. This oval here is representative of the table at the French cafe. And the way French cafes work, you walk in, it's not like, say, Starbucks or a cafe in our culture. You walk into this place, you just sit down. You rarely have to deal with the hostess. And then while you're sitting there talking with your friend, you're smoking a cigarette, a waitress comes over and they bring you whatever you want, and then they walk away. It's there's not a lot of, France doesn't have a culture of people coming in and checking in on you, like, oh, how are you doing today? How are you liking your salad? How are you liking your bottle of Suze? They don't do that. They just, if you want them, you wave. Otherwise, they just leave you alone. So Picasso and Braque would sit down at these cafes, they would sit down with their newspaper, and they would order a bottle of booze in the afternoon. They're not drinking during the day. They're not alcoholics. And they're just hanging out, talking about what's in the paper, talking about life, talking about culture, maybe even talking a little bit about the bottle of wine sharing. But ultimately, it is all around this table. So what Picasso did next is similar to what Braque had done with the inclusion of the other material. Here he actually takes the newspaper that he was reading, which is a very influential French newspaper called Le Figaro, and it's going to come up in just a moment, and he rips it apart and he adheres it to the canvas. Because what easier way to convey a sense of the action of reading a newspaper than to include the physical newspaper. To include the label of the bottle of wine is to allude to the fact that they're having this specific bottle of alcohol. And then there are just some rough shapes like this to indicate that there's a glass, indicate that there is some other thing on the table, maybe a salt shaker, and then this pattern here to indicate the fact that there is some sort of decorative motif where they are. So analytic cubism was about looking in one direction and breaking that thing apart. Synthetic cubism is about looking all around and accumulating all of that noise. So it's like, I have this mug here, I have a water glass here, I have, like, it's all going to be in the thing at the same time. Like, it's all here. That's synthetic cubism. It's all there. In 1912, Pablo Picasso gave us this work, which was the first of its kind, the most perplexing of its kind, and the most influential of its kind. Still life with chair caning. It's an oval-shaped canvas. Both Braque and Picasso were working in this shaped canvas. They were really interested in how, instead of it being a window, like square window on the world, by being a round shape, it becomes a different sort of window. It plays with our perceptions of what we're looking at a little bit more, and breaks with the historical tradition. That's the big thing they're trying to do. They're actually trying to rearrange history slightly so that they can come out on the other end. We can come out on the other end, because they're doing this for the collective. They're doing it for all of us. The painting's history is our history. So, he takes this round canvas. He puts a rope around the edge. It's a real rope around the edge of it. In the middle, he actually has this scene, which is yet another cafe scene. So where in the still life with the bottle of Suze, he gives you an oval shape to indicate a cafe table. Here, he's just giving you that oval shape because that's the shape of the cafe table. Oftentimes, these tables would have some sort of edge around them. Sometimes that would have been rope. So this is both a break with history, but also an allusion to a broader world that exists exists in tandem with painting. So he makes this painting, this still life, on this circular canvas, a still life that is representative of the table that they're sitting at. But then he puts this thing in there. And you might look at that and say, oh, well, he's put actually the chair caning, the material that they're sitting on in the cafe, in there. Because that's what it looks like. But actually, instead of doing that, he has gone and found a piece of paper that has a print on it that is of this material. And he takes that and he puts that in there. Now, he does all of this, and in sum, what it operates as is this constant conversation about what's real, what's fake, what's a decision by the painter, what is him incorporating things from outside of the world. And so you have this real rope, and so you think, okay, I'm looking at something that is both real and fake. And then you look at the chair caning, and you think it's like the rope, it's real chair caning. But then when you find out that it's printed on paper, as will be indicated on any wall text around the painting, you understand that he's playing with you on yet another level. So you think you know what you're looking at, but you don't actually know what you're looking at, because the painter has played tricks on you. Picasso famously said that art is a lie. It's just about lying, which can be understood as it's about illusions. It's about making the viewer think they're looking at something when actually they're looking at a different thing. Now, this goes all the way back to Ingres. He made his viewers think they were looking at a woman when actually they were looking at an arrangement of oil and pigment on a flat surface. Now, fast forward 100 years and we get to this, which is a very aggressive break with that kind of history, with that mode of history. He's deliberately changing this stuff up. So, that is Pablo Picasso. One guy I want to bring up is Juan Gris. Juan Gris is one of the Salon Cubists, in that he wasn't Picasso, wasn't Braque, but was one of the first Cubist painters in Paris to pick up on the examples given by Picasso and Braque. He was very close with these two guys. He was in their studios often. He painted with them often. But he was always a little too hard-lined to really create works that were revolutionary the way that these works are. I mean, these works were very, very difficult for the French audience to understand. This work, however, if you saw this work and you were confused, and then you saw this work, it would make sense. Because here, again, you have the allusion to the cafe table, but there are these like super direct indicators. Well, first of all, it's a square canvas. So he's put the shape of the table, where Picasso had just given you the shape as the whole canvas. There's this knife that recedes back into space, or back into space. Also a cigarette that recedes back into space. There's a thing that is sitting on the table that's very legible. We understand that that's a wine glass. We understand that it's sitting on a table in this orientation. You know, so Gris gives away a lot of the secrets of Cubism in a way that is very helpful for people that don't get what Picasso and Braque were doing, but in a way that is, I think, I just wonder if he really understood what he was going for, or if he was maybe doing it because he liked the aesthetics. He liked actually how it looked, not necessarily the reasons why. So, that is Cubism. We're going to pause. Alright, really quickly, we're going to wrap up today with the Futurists. Futurism. Remember how just a few minutes ago I said that Pablo Picasso had cut apart one of the more popular newspapers of the day called Le Figaro? Well, here is Le Figaro. And it was such a popular newspaper of the day that when Italian poet and rebel Marinetti wrote a manifesto for a new kind of art, but also more specifically a new kind of writing, he sent it directly to Le Figaro and asked them to publish it on the front, which they did on the front page. And I know you can't really see all that well, but this whole thing and this are the Futurist Manifesto, the Manifesto de Futurists, and front and center. So 1909, right around the time that Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso were becoming buddies, and they had yet to really move into the studio, this manifesto was published and really kind of blows the doors open for a new kind of thinking about art, but also more specifically a new way of thinking about industrialization. That's a really big change. So I told you that, you know, people like Paul Gauguin and even Georges Pierre Seurat, they were really apprehensive about industrialization and trains and speed and volume and all that stuff. And the Futurists saw it the other way around. For them, it was an exciting time. It was a time of new possibilities. It was a time for new political change. And the creative arts, creative practice in general, was going to be a very big part of that situation, of that move, of that progression. And so when Marinetti wrote this, it was a kind of a call to arms for radical artists to come together and, instead of constantly being preoccupied with the stories of the past, to really push forward into the future. And that's where they got their name, the Futurists, because they were thinking about the future. They were making work about the future, and ultimately they were just huge proponents of forward progress and what that looks like, but also what that sounds like. So I said right up front that this was, Marinetti is not a visual artist, he was a writer. A lot of the initial people involved with the Futurist movement were also writers and not visual artists. However, within a few years, rather within, under 2 years, so in just under a few years, weird, you have the first sign of painting being affected by the futurist dictum. And the futurists, again, they were all about speed. They were all about privileging that frenzy and privileging that chaos ever so slightly. And in this work, Umberto Boccioni's The City Rises from 1910, we have what is widely referred to as the first futurist artwork, the first futurist painting. Now, Boccioni was witnessing the city and the world change around him. All of these artists had known or had a very close proximity to a more agrarian form of life. They lived on farms, they were from farm towns, they were from farming communities, and when you went into the city, you often went for a very specific reason, and then you left. And what this painting is symbolizing is a switch, where instead of people moving to the city and leaving, you have people, these people moving into the city and staying and changing the city, but also the city begins to change with them. And it's not always pretty. So, what do we have here? So we have one dude here, one guy here, one guy here, one guy here, other dudes over here. These are all dudes because this is industry. There's lots of little dudes back there. I'm zooming in. Whoa. Zoom in, zoom out. That was weird. I've never actually used that specific feature. But now that I know I can do that, I'm going to do it more often. That work? Yeah, check that out. Ooh, ain't that fun? Holy moly, escape. So, that was, I amused myself. What you have with all of these male figures, what they are battling is, or what they're straining against, are these animals, these horses. All of you have heard the term horsepower. Horsepower very specifically translates the energy expelled by an actual horse into the energy expelled by machines. It's 1-to-1. Horsepower, we all know it in relationship to car, but think of how that translates into the mobility and the faculty of the animal. Horses move slower, their horsepower is lower than a car, which is automated and can move faster. It's an important analogy for you to understand because Boccioni is here using the horse as the symbol for the agrarian coming into this new thing, and that new thing is the city. So the city has risen up around them. The city has given us these smokestacks in the back and these expansive factory units that exist in the background of this painting. That is all rising around them, and in the center you have the frenzy of the horse, this very large animal that is being controlled, being kind of tamped down and harnessed. It's not necessarily being squashed, it's being harnessed by man. Horsepower is being harnessed by man. Nature is being harnessed by man, and the possibilities of that are not seen as negative as they were in France and also a little bit in Germany with the German expressionists. Instead, it's a good thing. They are privileging this kind of development. They really like industry. That is a very important thing to understand. And so we have these horses being contained. But look at the way that Boccioni is using paint as well. He's using it very frenetically. He's moving very quickly when he's rendering the movements of these horses and of these men. There's all this motion going on. And in the background, you have this very static, very stable construction of a factory. So all of the frenzy of nature in the front is being put to use in this very standardized, very ordered, very calm industry in the back. The juxtaposition of those two things is very important for the message that Bacciouni is trying to convey. Giacomo Balla gave us Street Light. Now this work is from 1909, and I said that the Bacciouni work was the first futurist work. That's because some historians like to say that it's the first futurist work. This work, however, is from the year that Marinetti published the Futurist Manifesto, and so the argument can, should, and will win if you say that this work is actually predates the first futurist work and therefore becomes an earlier or possibly the first futurist work. First, second, last, genius, winner, all these things are kind of dumb things to toss around, so I'm not even going to bother with them. 1909, Giacomo Balla rendered a street lamp. He painted something that was so benign but was so revolutionary. For us it's benign. For them it was revolutionary. Beforehand you had just the ambient light of nature. You had the moon, you had stars, you had some dimly lit windows, but ultimately if you're walking through the streets of downtown Milan, it's going to be very dark. And then all of a sudden, these street lights come in, and you can see things at night. You can see what you're doing. You can wander around and enjoy what you're looking at. But Balla wanted to really indicate what was happening with these things. It wasn't just about, look at how fancy the light is, because, yeah, sure, light's fancy. It's also about, look at what the light is doing to this thing. That's the moon, drawn in a crescent shape to make sure that we all fully understand that that's the moon. It's the moon. The moon used to be the brightest thing in the sky. I mean, arguably it still is the brightest thing in the sky at night from our perspective. But when you're walking on a street and there's street lamps, the moon's light is diminished and is overtaken by the light of these new street lamps. So what Balla is saying here is that industry is getting to a point where it is eclipsing nature. Now after 40 years of environmentalist activity, we look at these images and see them as kind of problematic. I imagine most of you being of a younger generation might not have ever experienced a world where you thought that this would be considered a good thing, where street lights are more powerful than the moon. I mean, actually the idea of light pollution is a big concern for a lot of people, and most people when they're in urban areas make the comment that there is that you can't see the stars, and this is the reason why, because we have these street lamps. But in 1909, when this was brand new, people were totally into it. They loved the street lamps. And Balla was saying the power that man has harnessed in these new street lamps is more powerful than the moon. So that's a fairly big claim to make. Balla. Funny, right? This is another Balla work. It's from a few years later. It's called The Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash, and it's just pretty cute. It sums up a lot of the way that the futurists thought about their works, where the Cubists were breaking things apart as a means of analyzing them or putting them together as a means of better understanding them. The futurists were really captivated by chronophotography, which is a kind of photography made popular by Muybridge, who I showed you previously. the running horse guy. So when what chronophotography did was it showed them the spectrum of motion, how things look when they're in motion. And this work is very, very specifically derived from looking at those kinds of photography. Etienne Mire is another guy, another chronophotographer who was working very closely with Edward Muybridge at the time for the development of these kinds of photographic images. Not these kinds, this is the painting, excuse me, but the kinds of photography that would influence this kind of painting. It's also just really cute, the little like dog with all its little feet moving. You get the impression that it's going really quickly to catch up because it's got such little legs. I don't know, it's funny. It's a crowd pleaser, everybody. It's a crowd pleaser. Baccioni. Generally speaking, if you go into one of the premier art museums all over the world, they're going to have a copy of this sculpture. It was made in a very large edition. I believe there might have even been some editions that were pulled after Baccioni's death, but unique forms of continuity in space. There are several different titles for this work that you're going to find. They will always have the terms form, continuity, space. Arguably, this is a painting of the continuity of forms in space. This is a three-dimensional sculpture of it. And so what we have here is a figure that is moving through space, right? But instead of just having them move, you have these kind of ghost gestures like this and this and this. You know, the idea is that as this person moves in this direction, all of the things, they're moving and their garments are going in this direction. Looks like I'm pointing at his abdomen. Look at those abs. He did some sit-ups today. So with all of the force of this person moving in this direction, all of these things are going in the opposite direction. So it's he is literally kind of looking at the way that things, people move through space. And one final thing is I want to show you some of these photographs that I'm talking about. All right, so to close, this is one of Etienne Marie's one of his chrono photographs, and you can see here that it involves having all of the different exposures of that camera on one plate. So what Muybridge did, the guy with the horse, he took a bunch of different single photographs and strung them together. What Marie is doing here is he's putting all of that information in one thing. And by doing that, he is given rise to a new kind of visual vocabulary. This is the kind of visual vocabulary that I'm talking about. This idea that all of the frames of motion are compiled into one single moment so that the viewer can reconcile this. And biologically, physiologically, our eyes can make sense of this. And it's more difficult for us and is more psychologically and conceptually and intellectually engaging. The Cubist works are those things, intellectually engaging, because they cause you to stop and think and actually try and break down the image. Whereas this kind of stuff, like the photography of Etienne Marie, it's much easier for us to see it and get it. And it's the same thing with this, except this is in sculptural form. And here we are at 1913. So we're going to have a few more lectures pre-1913, and then we're going to have our 1914 onward lecture. And you know, the First World War was crazy, and that's what we're going to get into. But for the time being, you know, ask me any questions. I've been getting some emails coming in, and yeah. Have fun.